Hello and welcome to another episode of the Way We Grow podcast, a production of the Craft Growers Network. I'm your host, Nick Wolfe, and today my guest is Ramsey Nubani of JR Crop Tech. Ramsey, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on the podcast. Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. You were, I've been doing this podcast now for almost half a year, and you were one of the first names that I thought of because when I was learning how to grow, especially when it came to crop steering and using some of these techniques that require like precision irrigation, precision data collection, and aggregation of that information, you were one of the first people that taught me what and how to do that. So it's a little bit of a full circle for me, but why don't you introduce yourself and just kind of give a little brief synopsis of who you are and what you do to the audience?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for following me and believing in me enough to take advice from me. So my name is Ramsey Nubani. I am a partner at JR Crop Tech. Josh Newlinger and myself started that business up. We're a consulting company that has now branched off into a few different verticals. We do fertilizer and cocoa substrate and soon to be some controls. I really set off into this industry a really long time ago when I was much younger. I got introduced to the plant and really enjoyed the symbiotic relationship I had with my life and just the herb itself. And then I had the pleasantry of being able to move to California at the early age of 20 and start growing out here with the medical marijuana program that was happening. And then just kind of through persistence and sheer grit of just not willing to give up, I was able to meet some incredible people that educated me. And I think that's so much as to why I'm willing to teach and share knowledge, because the only way I got to the point of where I am right now is people were willing to share with me and, trial and error and having belief in one another to get to the finish line. So yeah, that's kind of a quick synopsis of me. And the company was born out of just pure desire to embark on our own journey. Josh and I, we both worked for a lot of big companies prior to going out and consulting on our own. And then as we were consulting, we kept seeing gaps in the market space where we said, hey, like, why not just build our own products that actually fulfill those gaps? So that's kind of where we've been and where we're going with things, is just kind of it's continuously trying to improve what we're currently offered in this space right now.
For sure. I mean, from my own personal experience, the JR Crop Tech fertilizers are like the easiest thing to use in the entire universe. And we've even we've stopped using it for flour to try out something else, but we've simplified that something else into a 1-part flour. Rather than mixing up 3 different bags into 3 different batch tanks, we just mix it all into 1 batch tank, kind of following suit with what you guys have created, because it is so simple and it works so well, and it just makes everything else, if you're spending all that time formulating or mixing up your batch tanks or your fertilizer stock tanks at different points throughout a growing cycle, by removing that factor, you're adding so much more time into other aspects of the grow. And so I love that and I applaud it. I always recommend it to people because it's one of my favorites.
Well, and you mitigate mistakes by simplifying. I think that all too often people are overcomplicating. And even when I tell people, hey, with our fertilizer, we use just that, we don't add anything, everybody, just tell me the additives, tell me what you're doing on top of no, it's just JR Crop Tech start to finish. We don't change ratios. We keep it very simple. The product was born out of the idea of simplicity. We were mixing fertilizers because we couldn't get to the NPK values that we were looking for. And when I say we, Josh is the mad scientist behind this. Like, the guy's brilliant. And he was providing us a way of mixing it, and we were mixing it, and we just kept having employees and clients make mistakes with mixing it. And that's really where the fertilizer is bred from, is we originally made it for our consulting partnerships and the grows we were working with, and then our friends started wanting it, And that just kept blossoming further and further and further, where we're like, all right, hey, let's really go public with this and make it a real offering. And from something that was intended to make things more simple for our own teams, seems to have helped a lot of other individuals out, which was our goal and intent with it. It's like,
For
how
sure.
much easier can we make it for everybody to get the results that they deserve to have, and then can we eliminate some troubleshooting where like you could just kind of check a box off, like, all right, I know the fertilizer is good, let's go on to the next thing. What else can it be?
For sure.
Because yeah, mixing fertilizers, having multiple different parts. I've gone into facilities where people are adding 10 different things to their recipe, and whisper down the lane quickly messes that up when you have
Yep.
people all doing different things at different times. So yeah.
For sure. Or someone like being like, "Oh, go pick up where I left off. I left off at 4," and then
Yeah.
they accidentally add 4 again or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the greatest products or inventions, let's say even ever created, were not necessarily to fill a market gap or something. It was to create something that the person who created it needed it for, right? Like to make your life easier, to make your consulting business that much more honeable, like where you could really dial in everything so that you're not going, oh, well, this person's using this and this person's using that, so we got to change it this, and it makes it a lot easier and it makes the approach more uniform.
Yeah. a hundred
So
percent.
I totally get that. Well, you talked about starting, you moving out to California when you were 20, but I always like to find out sort of what started people's passion for the plant in general. And, some people start with vegetables with grandma and grandpa. They start with cannabis right out the gate when they're in high school or something along those lines. So where did your passion for plants start altogether?
So I was fortunate enough that I have both sides of my mom and my dad come from farmers. So my mom's maiden name is Duplantis, so that means in French the planter.
Okay.
And so I grew up with a grandfather that in Louisiana constantly had a garden going, because really that was part of the way of eating. It wasn't really much of an option outside of, hey, if we want to have food all the time, we got to grow our own food to have. And then on my dad's side, my grandfather was really big into apple orchards and also having a garden. So we, no matter which elder I went and visited, there was always some sort of level of farming involved with it. My dad loved having fruit trees too, so orchards were kind of a common theme, and just being raised that the weekends we spent working outside and building the property, landscaping, and doing that. So that was like my initial introduction to agriculture, where I saw such a passion from my elders into what they were doing, and it was more than a hobby. It was like a lifestyle, like, all right, we want to make this better, and every year there was improvements and things that they were doing. So I liked the idea of being able to create and try and attempt to improve on things year over year, and the techniques of pruning that every crop allowed you to do, where you could do one thing to one crop and something else to another. So that was a lot of my early introduction. And then I got introduced to the cannabis plant after having knee surgery. I was an avid soccer player and I tore my ACL, and I was in school, and the gentleman in front of me was like, "Hey, how you doing?" And I was like, "Good, but not good at the same time." The painkillers they had me on were making me really nauseous and just weren't doing me too well. And he was like, "Oh, have you ever heard of cannabis?" And at the time he called marijuana or weed. I forget exactly what he said, but
Sure.
I was like, "Yeah, I've heard of it, but I'm not really." I was young. I was 15 years old,
Okay.
actually 14 years old. So I was like not super clever to all of what it was. And he was like, "All right, well, if you're interested, I could get you something. You could try it out." And so that was my initial introduction, was purely and truthfully on the holistic mindset of it.
Sure.
Can it help me with coping with the surgery that I just had? So after I got introduced to it, the business mindset of me was like, "Oh wow, okay, this is expensive," and all my friends were wanting it, and I saw an opportunity where I was able to help service friends and make a little capital at the same time. And that became the relationship early on. And then the first time I grew it, I had a batch of weed that had a ton of seeds, and I just was like, all right, let's buy a book about it, which was Jorge Cervantes' Grow Bible. That was the first book I
Sure.
got. And the information in there was not the most helpful. It gave me some good stuff, but it was not as direct as I thought it would be. So the first crops I ever grew, I completely like killed. It took me like 10 tries of growing in a little grow tent before I got any sort of, flower off of it. And then I saw that it was really easy to grow plants outside, so I started growing them outside, which aided just, made it really simple. I was guerrilla grow, throw some seeds here, here.
Mm-hmm.
If they made it to fruition, great. If they didn't, whatever, it was no loss. So that journey just kind of propelled me down this line of wanting to learn and understand more. And I just kept digesting more and more books about how do you grow and what do you do. And I would say that I didn't really get a real grasp of what I was doing until I moved to California, where there is just a much broader audience of people and a network where you could connect with other individuals. And believe it or not, the first group of growers that I got connected to were the Hells Angels. And
Wow.
yeah, they're in San Diego. Huge harbor for Hells Angels is down in San Diego. And I got introduced to one of the sons of a Hells Angel, and his whole thing was he loved the cannabis crop and the botany behind it, and started talking, connecting with them, and we just bonded, and that kind of blossomed because he would take me over to a bunch of different little grow sites that they had, and I mean, very rudimentary, and they were very strategic about how they did things. They kept moms in one places, propagation here, veg here, flower here, so nothing was ever in one location. And this is
Okay.
like really early Prop 215 days. So I got to be exposed to a lot of cool things and ideas and concepts, and it was always really interesting to me seeing these really tough individuals that were caring for this plant and so in love with it that you saw a different side of their emotions
Sure.
than you typically wouldn't see. When you meet them in the biker bar, they all seem really brawly and tough, and then you go see them in their garden, and it's like, oh, whoa, these are really,
The
really
gentle
nice
giant with the
individuals. Yeah,
plants.
gentle giants. So, yeah, that kind of roundabout started out through knee surgery, and then kind of just kept blossoming into a passion and a career where I saw a little bit of love and money all in one scene. So that kind of just hit home, and I was doing construction throughout the whole thing. So learning how to grow went hand in hand with construction, because you could be this awesome grower, but if you couldn't build what your mind had and what you thought the plant needed, you kind of weren't going to go too far. So I think I got a level up that I was really good at construction. So when it came to building the grow rooms and adapting them and making them better, I was able to do a lot of things that my friends that didn't have as good of construction background, they weren't able to do that as much.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You hear people saying, "Oh, I was a contractor, or construction, or electrician, or plumber," right? And then eventually you're all of those things when you need to make the grow continue to work, especially if you're, duct tape, sweat, and tears to make sure that it all stays together.
Yeah.
What were some of the first like successful grows that you were a part of? Because it sounded like early on, figuring it out in your tent. You said it took you like 10 tries to even get your first harvest. So maybe talk a little bit about the success, that first successful harvest, 10 tries in. And then from there, when you like, what were some of the decisions that led you to moving to California? And then kind of talk a little bit about some of those grows and what the style was and how you where you found success there.
So the failures that I was hitting really early on was way too hot of a tent. So I was growing in a tent in a closet, and as you can imagine, HPS lights were the only option. There was no
Oh,
LEDs
sure.
or anything else like that. So I'm growing with a 1,000 watt HPS light in a
What
closed
year was
closet.
this roughly? Sorry.
This is so I was 17, 16, 17 years old. So I'm 38 now. So this is 22 years ago.
Wow.
So 2003, sometime around then,
Okay.
2002.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was failing because the grow room was getting way too hot, and I was, I didn't have any sensors in there really much of anything. I got a little hydrometer, and that's what really led me down the path of, okay, this is too hot. So I moved the tent into the garage and got a much better success out of it. But then the smell was so much that we kind of were like, all right, this is not smart. We're going to get ourselves in trouble. So after I went from that, growing outside was really the clearest success I was having. And that was just so easy. And it kind of brought reality to me that a lot of what was being written in books about this being a really difficult plant to grow was purely just circumstantial based. Like
Sure.
you throw the seeds out, they germinated really quickly, they grew extremely hardy. Yeah, I would get seeds in my crop because you would have herms. Most of the seeds I was getting were in flower, so it had to either come from a herm or another male. Because I was guerrilla growing, I didn't have the chance to always like check the plants all that much, but it was clear that it was easy. You'd end up with some like prolific plants, and when you won big. Like if a plant finished early and did well, it had a couple pounds on a plant, and you were just like, all right, this is a home run. And at the time of pounds being 7,000 a pound, 2 pounds is worth $14,000. At a young age, you're like, all right, I just struck gold.
And was this in Louisiana? Did you say
This
that
is
that's
in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. So I grew up in an area
okay?
called New Hope, Pennsylvania. And then what took me from growing and living on the East Coast to the West Coast was I went out to the West Coast on a vacation trip and was introduced to the fact that there was medical marijuana and that you could go into a dispensary and buy weed legally, and that with the card you could grow it legally. And I think I always had, a little bit of that, my parents in the background telling me, you got to figure out what you're going to do with your life. And, so many people telling me that I was going to end up in jail or that this wasn't going to work, that I always, sought a way to do this legally. Like I don't think my intent was ever that I wanted to do something illegal. It was, hey, this is an awesome plant. People seem to love it. I enjoy it. How can I be involved with this? So,
Yeah.
Growing up on the East Coast, it was just illegal. There was no options what to do. And then seeing that the West Coast had some legality, at that time of being 19 years old, I was like, okay, do I stay in the United States or do I move to the Netherlands and try my hand out in Amsterdam? Because I was very aware that you could go to Amsterdam and buy weed legally from a coffee shop. So when I got introduced to this, I didn't know at all that California had a medical marijuana program. It wasn't until I went out there and they were telling me that they had it that I was aware of it. So I was like, all right, hey, this is in the United States. I don't have to move to a completely different country. I don't have to learn a whole new language. This is feasible. So I moved out to California, got a construction job, and pursued my cannabis career out there. And then that would be my first successful grow. Was I built a 2-light grow room in the back of my apartment that
Okay.
I had an exhaust fan on one side and a window open on the other. And I mean, I just used passive air. I didn't have AC units or anything like that set up. San Diego is great because as soon as sun sets, it's usually pretty cool. It wasn't like there was constant heat all year round. For the majority of the year, it'd be warm during the day and cool at night. So that just worked out hand in hand for success. And that was my bare basic of ideas of how to control the environment. Was getting introduced to a climate controller, and I call it a climate controller, but it was like the Titan little temperature stat thing where you could set a temperature and then it would turn on whatever device according
Sure.
to that temperature. So that was my climate controller, and I was hand watering everything at this time, growing in soil, hand watering it, and I just kept seeking out from there more and more of the network of people that were growing and willing to share. If I met anybody that said they had a grow or grew a plant or anything, I would talk to them for days, and I became very friendly with at the time, what was the real resource information was the hydro stores. So I started at SD Hydro, going there, and then I met the guys at Mighty Hydro, and they were just a wealth of network. So they were so open to introducing me to other growers, that was a nice benefit as well. So I'd say, yeah, first successful grow on the East Coast was just moving the tent out of the closet into the garage. First successful grow in California was at an apartment, literally a studio apartment, where I turned the walk-in closet all into a grow.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I feel like that's the progression of a lot of stories. It sounds like, just where you're starting small and then you go to like either a bigger tent or a little room and you start to figure out your environmental controls and boom, you're off to the races. Because I feel like that's one of the big ones that is, it's not that it's less talked about, but it's not the most glamorous side of growing, whether that be like choosing your nutrients or choosing the light that you're going to grow with. It's like, oh, actively conditioning the space in which you are growing to make sure that the environment's correct. It's something that I feel does go under the radar a lot of times early on with growers.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are so focused on irrigation strategy, they forget that the the order of operations is lighting, climate, irrigation, and then genetic in terms of like what I think really drives success. And if you don't have climate, then I don't care how great you are at setting an irrigation program, you're not going to have a successful crop. And I
For
think
sure.
that's been like the key to a lot of success is recognizing that climate controls everything.
Absolutely. I mean, even within what you're saying there of light and then climate, both of those in tandem are going to somewhat dictate your irrigation program. And so if you're putting the cart before the horse, then you aren't going to find success because you're going to be chasing your tail, whether it be, too much heat, too much humidity, not enough airflow, whatever that might be.
Yeah. I think that simplicity has always been the theme to my success in a lot of this stuff. And, my whole journey has been predicated on like, how can I figure out the easiest way to do this where you get the most out of it? And, I think that's led to a lot of success, at least for me, is just I've simplified a lot of overly complicated things.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's a great path to take in terms of becoming a teacher of this plant as well, because by simplifying it for yourself, you're trying to find the most direct path through in some cases, right? And so when you're finding that direct path through, you're reiterating it in your mind over and over again and trying to come up with, oh, maybe I can skip this, or maybe I can reduce this step down. And by the time you have it, and then if you are talking to other growers all the time or going to the hydro shop and talking to the guys there and figuring out what they're doing, and if you can incorporate that into your system, talking it through reinforces that taught information to yourself, and then it allows you to even be a better teacher to people in the future, which almost sounds like was part of your path leading into the future of becoming this sort of not an maybe an authority figure on part of this cultivation practice that we all are passionate about. What was your first experience then, going from your 2 lighter in the back of your apartment? What was your first experience with like a large scale grow that you were a part of?
So the progression kind of went from 2 lighter to first real automation, which was an introduction to drip system, but that failed completely because they were the open flow drip emitters. So my first real automation was flood and drain. And
Okay.
then again, tighten controls for my climate control and using window AC units. The first commercial step I made was in Los Angeles. I got a warehouse that had 150 lights in it. So there was a lot of home grows that went between that step to the warehouse. But the reason why I was able to get to a warehouse was flood and drain as my automation for irrigation system. That really did allow me to start expanding my footprint because I got introduced to a really easy to use fertilizer at that time called Veg Bloom from Chris. He's from San Diego. Through his channels, I actually got introduced to flood and drain, and I said, okay, this is simple. I could make it repeatable. So I went from my apartment grow to a house with a grow in a garage, and then that led me into multiple other people's homes where
Okay.
they all had medical cards and they were wanting to set up grows. So my information got passed out as the person that could build them the grow and consult for them on how to
Okay.
grow their flower. And so I would go set up all these automated flood and drain systems with just tightened controls for the environments where they would run either a standard AC unit and then have some exhaust fans or dehumidifiers, but very simple stuff. And so I was doing flood and drain, everything. I would start my veg plants out like that. I would do the flower like that. The only thing I wouldn't flood and drain was my cuttings, but that led me to a commercial warehouse where I got introduced to a gentleman that had the warehouse, had the nonprofit set up for a caregiver style business, and I went through and started operating that. It was on a flip system, so there were 75 lights on during the day and 75 at night. The system was always running. But the automation of being able to just set up a flood and drain and walk away from it and then only have to go there once a week to top off the tanks. And again, simplicity. I was not adding a bajillion parts to my fertilizer routine. I was more or less following the Lucas formula, but at that time with
Sure.
cutting it, by the time I got to the warehouse, I was now using cutting edge. So it went like veg bloom, one part more or less, to cutting edge, and kind of ran that for a little bit. And that got me into the commercial space where I started getting a little bit more of a name for myself, because now I was in both markets, San Diego and Los Angeles. And I was getting into a lot of really good dispensaries, starting to get more and more of a name for myself in that regards. And then that's also when I got introduced to a more proper idea of cultivation techniques. So I've been sharpening my tool all this time, and then I started to get introduced to the Grodan methodology of things, like how are they setting up stuff, what were they doing. I started to get introduced to more technologies in terms of climate control and things that you could use. This is when the Smart Bee, I don't know if you remember that. I don't know how long
Smart
you've been in
bee.
the. Yeah, Smart Bee was Sky Hankey's, God rest his soul. He made this smart controller, climate controller, and that was the first real introduction to something that could control your AC units and exhaust fans and CO2 regulator all in one.
Okay.
So you weren't just touching a bunch of dials, it was kind of housed into one place. And then at that same time, that's when I was getting introduced to the Grow Sense. It was back when it's this big, bulky thing. So we're getting introduced to these cooler technologies, and that systematically started to push me down into more and more automation pieces. I then got raided by the FBI and DEA for one of the grows that I was operating, and I kind of was taken back into this, like, all right, reset mode of how do I get myself back on my feet. I didn't get arrested because everything was within state of California compliance, but they did take all of my stuff. So it wasn't
Sure.
like, no loss. It was definitely a loss. But I had really good friends that got me back up on my feet. And that's when I started looking for even more legitimized ways of being a part of this industry. And so I just kept seeking out, who were the knowledge holders and who were doing things differently, what was going on. And I at that point, I was really looking at going into the vegetable market and spending my time there, and trying to really figure out, like, how do I continue on this path of agriculture, but without having the headache of constantly having to look over my shoulder and deal with, like, the ups and downs of the industry. Because every year, and sometimes multiple times a year, there was massive resets to the cannabis industry where
Yeah.
you would lose everything, whether it was your grow that was getting raided or a buddy's grow or a buddy's dispensary or this or that. And when those happens, there's no, like, oh, you have insurance for this money, like, hey, the dispensary closes down, you don't get your money back, like, this happens, you don't get your money back. So I was tired of that constant draw of things and trying to figure it out. And that's what led me to Grodan. And then Grodan really took me to another level of knowledge where they exposed me to some of the most advanced growers in the world, not cannabis, but vegetables. So, like, they would take me to these 100-acre glass greenhouses with tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and eggplant and all these other crops. And I was just in awe on all the automation that they had.
Just to
And
clarify, you started working for Grodan?
yep. So
Oh, what position did you have there?
so I was a account. I think they called me account rep or account holder. And then they also had me as a crop advisor. So they were looking for somebody to move to San Francisco and help advise cannabis growers on how to use the grow sense. So because I had some prior knowledge on it, and I obviously had extensive knowledge on growing cannabis, they felt like I would be a good match for them. And the biggest advantage that they gave me was the willingness to educate me through their network of people. So I would go on site to these really large veggie grows, and I would find out when they heard that I was like a cannabis guy as well, because that's always how I was introduced was, oh, hey, this is Ramsey. He's heading up the Bay Area in the United States, and he works in
I
the
feel like you
cannabis
could
side.
say that alone, and people are like, ah, I know what this is about.
Yeah, and so it was kind of cool going to Canada and the Netherlands and meeting these really amazing people and them opening up their door where we would finish the company tour and then they would take me on the private tour where I'd be like, all right, cool. They bring me to
Hell
their
yeah.
house and show me their grow that they have in the garage. So they have 100 acres of glass greenhouse, and then in their garage they have cannabis plants growing there. And I was like, all right, this is the next level stuff, you know. And while
Quick
I was working,
question.
shoot,
What type of vegetable or produce or whatever agricultural product, let me formulate my sentence correctly here, out of all the different types of vegetables and produce and stuff you saw grow, who out of those growers were the best cannabis growers?
honestly, they all had different values to add in different ways because, you know, again, not many people were communicating with each other still at this time, but these guys were just so advanced. You know, their input on technology on how to use climate controllers to manage the grow and their understanding of VPD. I think that was like the first real exposure I had to VPD. Nobody was talking about vapor pressure deficit, anything. But when you got into these greenhouses, everybody talked about the same thing, and I came clever to that. That was probably like a very big eye-opening situation to me is when I walked into one of their grows in Canada, and this guy's indoor room was the most immaculate grow I've ever seen. It really represented his craft, and I thought to myself, like, how are your plants this healthy in an indoor grow? Because I'm just not was not accustomed to seeing things just go that well. And
Wow.
he had humidifiers set up and dehumidifiers and the lighting and the CO2, and he had a true drip irrigation system where he was controlling the volume of going to every plant. And, you know, at the time, we still really, you know, Josh, I really do account for the reason why we see drip irrigation systems in the cannabis space is Josh Newlinger. He was working for Netafim and really pushed to have that brought into our space. But up until him bringing a lot of this, every grow I went to and all the knowledge we had was hard, you know, schedule 80 PVC with open flow drip emitters. You know, like a lot of it was very much on the style of what was the green irrigation system?
Like Rainbird or something like that?
No, not even. But anyways, it doesn't really matter. But everybody had pretty much an open flow irrigation system. So, you know, no matter how much we tried to dial things in, it was either we were improperly using fertilizer, or two, the fact that we just had a shitty irrigation system that one plant was getting a ton and another one wasn't. That was I think just the biggest eye opener, and the way they thought about cultivating in the veggie space was like nothing I've seen in cannabis. Everybody did 1,000 different things to the plants trying to make them perfect. You know, like they're de-leafing a ton, topping and bottom pruning, and you have to spray these 1,000 different things. And when I talk to these veggie farmers, they're like, yeah, we have one spray a week that we use for, pest management or, vitality of the crop. And we have a 2-part fertilizer, and we have, a flow rate that we provide to the plants where everything's getting homogeneous volume to it. And I just thought to myself, like, okay, this is the solution that we need. They have robotics. Like, where we're at with cannabis right now is where the veggies were, 10 years ago.
Sure.
We're still so far behind the veggie growers. They keep advancing further and further, and we keep thinking like, oh, we're ahead of everybody else. Like under canopy lighting and side lighting, these are all things that the veggies were doing 10, 15 years ago. LED lights, like very, very much were introduced and being pioneered and ran by these veggie growers. The robotics that we're just starting to see kind of come into the cannabis space, like all that was really, really prevalent then. And so I just kept walking from grower to grower to grower in the veggie world and asking them questions and getting introduced. And that's where they really drove to me like so much the importance of what they focused in on when managing their veggie grow was just VPD. Like
For sure.
that's what they eat, sleep, drink. Like they would just do VPD. They, when they were looking at their data every day, was the VPD on point. Everything else was secondary. Okay, like let's change this because the VPD. And that was just such a big change for me, where I started to see the bigger picture of stuff. Because up until that time, I was one of the people that were flawed in thought, that I was like, oh, it's all about the irrigation system, like I need to run a flood and drain to get all of my plants watered at one time, and I would just set an arbitrary irrigation strategy and run with it. I'd have some manipulations because, like one irrigation a day in the beginning, and then by week 3 I was at like 10 irrigations a day. And that was like my crop steering, because those are still crop steering, but
Sure.
that was at the time my naive knowledge. The word crop steering and that real emphasis that you can manipulate the environment in irrigation strategy, all really was driven into my brain from Grodan, because they had their 6-phase model that they would apply to all their tomatoes and cucumber and pepper farmers, where they would go through how to set the fruit and all this other stuff. And Armando Suarez would drive that knowledge into my brain, because I got the pleasure of traveling a lot with him around the world. And he was like, oh, you see how they do this and they do that. And I was like just mind blown that you could start manipulating the climate and substrate EC. It's not really the irrigation that did the manipulation, but it was substrate EC, how high you let it get or how low you brought it, that really manipulated how fast a plant would set fruit or bulk fruit. And I just was like mind blown by that, because nobody in cannabis was talking about it. We were all still talking about, do you top a plant 10 times or 1 time, and planting density, and very minimum were people talking about substrate, because really at that time it was just peat, cocoa, rockwool soil, and like not much of an understanding as to like where the value points were. Hydroponics was always spoken about as rockwool, often forgotten that cocoa is hydroponics as well. But that was, really the driver, where I saw most growers, it was either soil growing or rockwool growing. And a lot of the better growers just happened to all be on rockwool because things happened faster, and, it was a little bit more consistent. And I think that was another piece to this puzzle, was just going from the veggie guys, seeing what they were doing, going to cannabis guys, pulling parts of everybody, what they were doing, and trying to put it into this 6-phase model.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, the crop steering being such a trigger word nowadays, where some people are like all about it, and that's their like mentality when approaching cultivation, and some people just go, nope, not even going to touch that, don't even want to think about it. where, I feel like there's a good even ground where it's more about understanding the increase or decrease of abiotic stress on the plant, whether that be through some sort of osmotic stress in the root zone or some vapor pressure deficit stress or lack thereof within the environment. Would you mind just doing like a quick run through for the viewers who may not know a lot about crop steering, and talk about sort of the generative vegetative cycle and what some of those key points are that that might help people sort of start looking down that path and maybe gain a little more interest to it?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, everybody that's growing a plant is crop steering. So let's just set the foundation that if you are changing any element from one step to the next, you are crop steering because you're purposefully doing something to get a result. So you're changing an input or a variable that gives you a different output. So vegetative growth is typically depicted as vertical fruit producing leaf, shoot, and roots. Like that's typically what people have in their mind. Now, vegetative steering can also be used to bulk your produce up. So whether it's a vegetable, a fruit, or a flower, this enhances the development of it. Generative steering is usually based around stressors, things that help set the fruit or the flower and then also help ripen the crop. So with cannabis, typically speaking, people go through vegetative phase during 18 hours of light. That the whole concept then is really building up your root, stalk, and leaf. And then the first couple weeks of flower, you typically are vegetative. There are different strains in cannabis, so there are ones that are sativa and indica. Indica plants you could steer vegetative almost all the way through. Sativa type plants you tend to steer more generative in the beginning weeks to set flower faster, but then go through a bulking cycle, and then everybody finishes. Doesn't matter which genetic it is, everybody finishes with a generative cue. Again, we want our crops to finish. So if you keep pushing vegetative, that's when you get what are called these blown out flowers, where it's pushing white hairs to the very end. So you want your crop to senesce. And that's true across any agricultural thing. Is like everybody's trying to get the fruit to develop and then to finish and ripen, because harvest time is what equates to profit. So in a nutshell, crop steering is a manipulation of either lighting, climate, irrigation, and cultural practices like plant touch. Those are the ways that you can manipulate the plant. And any one of those ways that you manipulate it, you're doing something for a desired outcome. So that is crop steering in itself. It's just manipulation of a crop to get a desired outcome. I always like to tell people that the data and the information is only good as your ability to look back at what you're doing. So the idea behind crop steering is collecting data so that way you can analyze it to make decisions about it, so your next crops hopefully see improvement.
For sure.
And that's the key to the success of any good farmer, is that year over year you're wanting to learn from the things that you've done. And in cannabis, we have such a high turnover in our crops that we get to have, typically speaking, 5 tries in a year to perfect something, if you're going to run the same genetic in all 5 crops that you could pull a year. But the idea is taking that information and making small adjustments round after round to make an improvement out of it.
For
So
sure.
a lot of what I tell people too is that in order to crop steer and do anything effective with your plants, you have to have good crop registration. So your ability to journal and record key metrics of success will provide huge dividends down the line. If you're doing all these climate manipulations, irrigation manipulations, plant manipulations, but not recording it, then you're really having zero effect to all the things that you're trying out. You're just kind of shooting
Yeah.
in the dark.
And I see a lot of people facing issues where they are almost like chasing their tail by say like chasing the data throughout a cycle where, let's say the environment's a little bit off. Oh, I think I need to tweak it. But then the plant starts to look a little off. Oh, I think I need to tweak it even more because now the plant's not responding as I wanted it to, versus having almost like a roadmap set out and you're following that roadmap start to finish, measure your results like you're talking about, as well as all those sort of key points throughout the entire growth cycle. When does it stop stretching? When does the bulking stop? When does the senescence start? When does the flavors really start to kick in? All these different metrics that you can then look back on and say, oh, well, if I maybe pushed generative steering towards the end a little bit sooner, I wouldn't have lost any weight, but I would have maybe ripened 6 days earlier and saved 6 days worth of cycle time, so that to put towards the next cycle. But yeah, some people, I do see a lot of people struggling with trying to chase the data rather than letting the data sort of explain some of the results that they had, so that they can then look at those as points of adjustment for the next cycle.
So I think the key with all this stuff is if you go to a doctor, all right, they're going to take your vitals, right? And they're gonna they're gonna reference those vitals to what they know is correlated to a healthy individual. So a lot of what I say our job is in growing is knowing first what is the baseline of a healthy crop, and then how good are we at correlating what we're currently seeing to what we know is healthy. So I think if anybody's just starting out on their journey, my best advice to you would be get some sort of sensor. Doesn't matter really which ones it is, as long as it's seen as an accurate sensor. If you then use that and create your baseline with that sensor, no matter what the reading is, that becomes your baseline to know that you have a healthy. So when I was working at Grodan, one of the cool things was going around to grows that they didn't have sensors at all, like no substrate data or anything. And I get to take this sensor and place it into a plant that looked phenomenal and get a reading from it. And it was always shocking to me to see what those readings were, because what a lot of us had this preconceived notion of a healthy plant and what it took to be a healthy plant was very far from what I actually was seeing in the data. And a lot of times when growers were first getting the data, whether it was when I was working at Grodan or when I worked with Arroyo, people would see the data for the first time and they would want to instantaneously change things, because in their brain they had this mindset that, oh, if it's outside of these parameters and this is going on, oh, the crop's going to... No, your crop's actually looking great. So we want to figure out what you were doing that's making it great. Take your thoughts of what make great out of your head, and let's just focus on like what you're currently doing that's already succeeding. And that was a really fun period of life, because now you could walk into 10 grows and most likely 9 of them are censored up, from substrate sensors, climate, to the whole gambit of stuff. Then when I was doing it, I would go visit 20 grows and maybe one of them had any sort of real like reliable data to it. Sure. And so it was so cool to go around and just record all these data points and then go back with those growers and say, okay, like, here's your data. Let's just digest what was going on here that led to this phenomenal result. Like, how did you get from this point to this point, and can we repeat the same thing again and get the same result? And that was really, really fun, because a lot of growers thought that you had to have really low EC to get a healthy plant, and we quickly learned through talking with people that had sensors and also seeing the information and working with the veggie guys, where it was common practice to feed a 3 EC and have between a 4 and an 8 EC in the substrate. But forever in cannabis, it was told like, oh, you're going to burn your crop and it's going to taste horrible. And we kept going around, and the best flower always had the highest substrate EC, like consistently, like the people, and whether they knew it or not, that was what was showing up in their
For sure.
substrates. Like they would be feeding out like a 1.5 EC, but have a 10 EC in their substrate. Their plants look phenomenal. And they were swearing the reason why they were having success was because they fed at such a low EC, but really it was because they were getting pretty much no runoff and their
Right.
substrate EC was high, creating this like more generative plant
Sure.
that was producing just beautiful, beautiful flower, great color to it, nose, terpene, everything. And that was just such a fun thing because it was like the unknown and things kind of unraveling and seeing that. So yeah, for any grower that's just starting out on this journey, go get sensors, install them into your grow. Do not look at the data at all for about a month, 2 months, however long you could resist looking at it, even if it's just a week. Just resist to look at it and then go and look at it. And you'll be surprised as to what you see, because if you're already getting a healthy crop, it's really interesting to see like what does that health look like? What are the vitals of that health? And that was
When when you were first looking into these the data points for these extremely healthy plants, just to sort of build that baseline of what is a healthy plant and what are we seeing based on the data with that, other than the substrate EC, because I feel like that is one of those things that people are extremely surprised about when they first start to take and monitor that data. What other points of data surprised you that you were like, wow, really, this is what's causing health in the plant?
VPD, that was the biggest one, is just climate. A lot of people thought that you had to run really, really cold climates to get these amazing looking crops. And I was actually finding the biggest yielding and some of the best looking product was coming out from warmer temperatures.
Sure.
So that was, a lot of these components started to add up pretty quickly where you were seeing, okay, well, the crops that were the healthiest were starting out warmer. The crops that were the most sought after usually were colder, and so it became this happy middle ground, which everybody was kind of already following, like start warm, finish cold. But what were the warm targets and what were the cold targets before you saw a diminishing return on that?
For sure.
And it really led to being not the extremes on one or the other, which a lot of people were very much on the extreme side. It was like they were either running really, really hot or really, really cold. Because again, majority of the industry didn't have control over their AC units the way we have control now. They couldn't
Right.
stage 3 units on now, two here, one here. It was, hey, wall thermostat, set it, forget it, hope it's hitting, making little adjustments here and there. So a lot of people either ran really cold or really hot, but it seemed like the ones that were always doing the best were always maintaining a good VPD, and
For sure.
then started warmer, finished cooler. So that was just a compilation of everything, starting to see it come together. That the 6 phase model that Grodan actually made for tomatoes aligned up almost identical to cannabis. I
That's
think the
crazy.
thing that shocked me a lot early on was the people that were running non-top plants and getting just massive yields out of it. And again, then starting to look at like, all right, what was the topping versus not topping, deleafing versus not deleafing. There was a trial that was done out in the Netherlands, and it was in a greenhouse, and they were doing it for substrate EC, but they didn't prune the plant at all. And I walked into that greenhouse and I just was in awe on how fat the bud was from the bottom of the plant to the top of the plant, without really any manipulation. And they said, well, in order to run a trial, you can't touch the plant.
Yeah.
And I realized, I was like, all right, this makes sense. Like, all right, if we're always manipulating too many variables, how do you know which variable actually did well? So I took that same concept back to the States and I said, all right, here's a list of growers that were all very interested in trying to figure this out. So at this time, we had the grow sense. This was the only graphical substrate data in the entire market. Nobody had anything. There was not a single company out there that was giving you graphical data for the substrate. So I had this like roster of growers that were willing to share and communicate and wanting to trial stuff. And so I was kind of coming back to them with a list of ideas of what I was seeing in Canada, what I was seeing in the Netherlands, and what I was seeing traveling the United States. And we all agreed that the first step to this was to not top plants. Like, all right, let's all go around and run trials on temperature and substrate EC and feed strategy without topping plants. And at this time, I was also talking to Josh now. I got introduced to Josh Newlinger. We would go around, and what we would do is I would find a grow that had no substrate data, get them laced up with the substrate data, which would automatically lead into a sale for replacing the irrigation system. And
I think I remember an anecdotal story of you guys where you knew that it was a cannabis grow when the 0.29 gallon per hour drippers would go out in numbers, and you'd be like, we got to go hit them up and see if they need substrate sensor data.
Yeah, so Josh basically would go to grows that were getting drip irrigation and connect them with me and say, hey, you need to get substrate data because now you have this awesome precision irrigation system that allows you to feed exact volumes of water to every plant in your room. Now get the sensors so you can make, good judgment calls as to what to be doing for your irrigation strategy. So I would either go in or he would go in. We would basically flip-flop connections. And so we became this duo, and then we started trading information. And it quickly became that I was talking to him every single day. Like, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what he's seeing. And we were just sharing information back and forth, what he was learning at Netafim, what I was learning at Grodan, and how do we compile this together. And then I had this housing of growers that were just so willing to take losses in their crop to trial shit out. So we started with the baseline: don't top, don't bottom prune, don't de-leaf. Let's just run that. And then we started to hone in on what are the right climate protocols and irrigation protocols to start achieving the results. We also were getting better and better climate control systems. So like there's more companies coming out that had climate controllers. So we're starting to get to integrate both good climate control, or okay, I should say, climate control, plus the irrigation data and the climate data to go hand in hand. So we're all trialing these things out. And if we saw something that worked, I would then go and share that same information with the other 5 or 6 growers that we had that I was talking to, willing to trial this stuff and say, all right, hey, here's what we're seeing at this other site. Let's try this now. De-leafing became, and a lot of what I'm talking about actually was the cultural practices of how you manage the crop that were our first real elements of changing. We were like, okay, hey, this climate strategy seems to work. This irrigation strategy seems to work. Let's now manipulate the plant touch. And then once we got to a point of non-top plants, center stripping, bottom pruning, like certain days of the flower cycle doing that, then we were like, okay, now let's go back to manipulating the climate strategy again, because we all felt like irrigation was at least somewhere on the baseline of things. And then Josh took a job working for Grow, and he said, yo, you should come work with me at this Grow. And that's when we both started working together on the Grow. And we took all this information that we were compiling and put it into the full gambit, because that was the first time I got to run a Grow with a real climate control system, the Netaflex. Josh, working for Netafim, he was like, all right, hey, here's the climate controller, here's the irrigation controller. Now let's actually start putting all this stuff to like real use. And so we got to take everything that we were doing and that we were trialing with all these people and put it to our actual fingertips. No longer do we have to deal with like this person thought or that person's. Let's just take everything compiled together and start doing that. And that was probably like catapulted us to a very fast pace of learning and understanding. And then our name started to get shared really, really quickly because people were catching on to like what we were doing. And that led us to like working for bigger grows, and diving into that a lot further, getting 40,000 square feet of like canopy that we were getting to play with and run these trials on a massive level, like huge
That's
level.
So crazy.
And then we just kind of kept pushing levers, and I think like a lot of that the story just becomes history from there. And still to this day, I would say to any grower that thinks that you've figured it all out, Go back to your notebooks, because I'm always improving. So, teaching has been the theme of this podcast. When you teach somebody, you learn your knowledge better. So, like,
Sure.
writing an SOP is a great practice for everybody to do, because it takes your knowledge piece, puts it to finite number and pattern and system, and then you get to see what you want to manipulate from it, because you've written out all the steps, and you'll start improving those things. Like, my
For
SOPs
sure.
are always evolving. I just edited some SOPs recently. So even when I think I've got, hey, this so down packed and it's perfect, no, there's no such thing as perfect. I always keep learning and adding one more element or one new piece, or taking something away that seems superfluous. Like, my crop registration started out with a really large net and we were capturing so much stuff. And now I've kind of narrowed it down to a very minimum amount of inputs, because I realized that there is a dilution too. Like, if you
Sure.
have too many data points, you're diluted. You're not able to focus on anything that really matters. So, again, like, how do you make things simple and get to the right concepts as fast as possible?
Yeah, on any like journey of knowledge, it always feels as though you get to a point where you're like, man, the more I know, the less I feel like I actually know.
Yeah.
Like, you get to a point where you think that, even though you've like maybe reached a goal within your learning, you go, shit, there's so much more now to learn. Because each one of those new avenues of knowledge sort of opens up more pathways of like, oh, I should explore this to have a better understanding of this or that. And I do want to touch back on a couple things that you talked about. One was VPD, and I feel like that is so important. You've touched on it a few times. And for growers, one of the things that I've learned is maintaining a day to night vapor pressure deficit that is somewhat uniform really helps remove possibilities of pathogen pressure entering into a grow. But one of the things that we've seen in terms of ripening of a crop, like you said, some people are running hotter temperatures all the way up into the end. But what I've seen is people increasing their differential from day to night in terms of the temperature, but still maintaining their vapor pressure deficit as even and uniform as they can from day to night, even though the slow trend is upwards in the vapor pressure deficit, like going drier overall as the
If you're
grow
lucky.
progresses. Sorry?
I said, if you're lucky.
If you're lucky,
Yeah, because
absolutely. Like,
when
this
you
is all,
drop when you drop temperatures, your dehumidifiers don't work as well.
absolutely.
So yeah, I always find that ideal world of things, but in actual application, I would say vast majority of the grows, you're going to see a decrease in your VPD. So you'll probably go, I always my target is a 1.2 VPD, 1.2 kPa. So kilopascals is how I like to measure, because you could either measure VPD in millibars or kilopascals. So I like the
Yeah.
kilopascals reading. So I'm talking about a 1.2 kPa day and night. What I see in my facilities, because no matter how hard we try to have the perfect equipment, after it's been running for a year or so, everything works a little bit less. But I tend to have like 1.2 VPD, 1.2 kPa during the day. And then in my last weeks, because I'm dropping down to like sub 70 degrees,
Sure.
your dehumidifiers do not operate as well. So my kPa will drop from a 1.2 during the day down to like a zero point 0.9 to 1.0. If I'm lucky and I have a brand new built facility, which I only have really one of those, we have another one coming online soon. That one's about the only one that holds 1.2 kPa day and night. It's very, very rare for me to come across, what I call legacy grows that are able to do that. No matter
Sure.
how hard we try, it's not feasible.
Absolutely. And that's a great point for all the listeners out there, is that your dehumidification equipment is going to have a harder time dehumidifying at a lower temperature, just because the operational temps for those really are ideal above like 75 5 degrees.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, as you start to increase that differential, like let's say your day temps just stay at 80 degrees start to finish, and you just are dropping that night temperature as you progress, then yeah, you start to get to those last couple weeks and you want to hit 68, 67 degrees at night. Yeah, it's going to really put a strain on your dehumidifiers, and you might need to kick all of them on when, earlier in the grow, you're only running one throughout the day and the night just to maintain.
Yeah, it's often how we choose what our low set point is at what point do we start seeing the VPD drop further? So
Sure.
when we're looking at how do you set an environment for a facility, we manipulate the temperature and see where the VPD rests. So like if we're targeting 65 degrees nighttime temp to finish, but our KPA drops down below a point 0.7, well then we're not doing 65. We're going to end up doing 67 or 70. And so then your next piece that you would play on is if you understand what your equipment's limitations are, then you could start effectively searching for genetics that operate optimally within those parameters.
Right.
I think a lot of people forget that, genetics are where you would pick up that slack. So your limitation of your equipment is your limitation. So like this is what makes a good driver is they're not trying to get their equipment to do things that it can't do. You're seeing it and saying, okay, how do I manage to safeguard my equipment so I'm not breaking it as often? And then how do I figure out which crops can I grow within this equipment that's going to give me the optimum result? So like, our goal with dropping temperatures and manipulating that climate in the last weeks is to get the plant to senesce. You want color, you want, orange hairs, red hairs, however you want to describe them. You want the plant to have finished off so that way you can get as high quality smoking product as possible. And so not all genetics need super cool temperatures to get purple and to senesce fully. So this is where genetic selection through pressure becomes quintessential. Is like, all right, here's my equipment that I have. You're not really changing that too much. Like nobody's got endless bank accounts to just do this. So whatever you've chosen and where you're at, what makes a great grower then is saying, okay, hey, here's my equipment limitations. Now let me find the right genetics to grow within those limitations.
Right.
And that's what's really the idea behind this whole concept of data and decision making is like, all right, let's see what my equipment can do. Let's track that. Let's optimize that. Once you've optimized your equipment, what it can do, then you optimize the genetics that work within that equipment. And that's really what I'm seeing take the amateurs, separate amateurs from the pros, is the people that
Absolutely.
understand that. Like you have all the hype genetics out there in the world, but does not mean you could take them and operate them in your facility.
Absolutely. It's one thing that does come up on this podcast a fair amount is Liebig's law and having sort of those different staves on the barrel. And if you have one that's too low, you might need to bring everything down to that level to make sure that it's operating as efficiently as it can. And we should never forget that there are more levers to pull than just irrigation, environmental, lighting. You should be looking at the genetics that you choose and does one room just not get to that temperature or humidity that you need it to? So maybe that's the room that you need to cut your lights down a little bit at one point, or run something that has a higher pathogen resistance. There's all these different factors that should be taken into account, but a lot of the times we kind of pigeonhole ourselves into thinking just about a few of them. So
Because
I think
everybody's
that's a
looking
great
over the
point.
fence all the time.
I'm sorry?
I said, because everybody's looking over the fence all the time. They see the new hype genetic and they want to run it. Instead of focusing on what they're doing, they're always looking over at what the next person's doing.
Yep.
I sometimes get frustrated with our industry and the mindset that a lot of owners and operators have that, oh, well, this new hot genetic, I've got to run this. Well, it became the new hot genetic because somebody ran it with success in their facility and did it to the nth level, and that's why people sought sought it out. You could do the same thing in your own facility and be the leader with whatever genetics you have and make your name if you dial it in the same. But just
Yep.
because you get that new genetic does not mean that the sales are going to follow that.
Absolutely.
So I think a
And there's a
lot.
lot of product scarcity in there too, right? Like a new genetic is really like there's a handful that just kind of blew up and stayed popular for years. But if a new genetic is out there and it's just grown by one person and they have some sort of branding around it, the reason why you're hearing about it isn't because it's everywhere, it's because they have this hype. But you're right, if it's grown in one facility, and let's say that it's some old legacy facility that has some quirk to it where the temperature does drop like crazy at some point in the cycle because whatever, they have some exhaust fan or something, it changes the whole way that you need to look at how you're growing that plant. That's a very good point.
Yeah, I think that the cultural practices are so forgotten nowadays, and everybody wants to grow by numbers. That my awareness to what's happening right now is what the really great growers are not growing by numbers. We're looking at, and I'm including myself, even though who am I? But what I see is that the people that are really driving success, we're looking at the trends that are happening in our facility. It's how good you are at getting your equipment maintenance and maintaining your equipment, because it's kind of like driving a race car. If you don't preserve your tires, you're going to be in the pit changing them. You're going to lose the race because you waste so much time changing them. What makes a profitable grow now is the ability to get to the 5 crops per year. You will not hear 6 crops out of my mouth. That's just a fictitious number. Like, I don't know anybody pulling 6 crops a year. 5 is realistic. 4 is bare minimum. But 5 is really what drives profitability. So how do we maintain our equipment in a way that allows us to get to that 5 crops a year? And then how do we choose genetics that fall within that system? It's like if you've got a certain cloning cadence and dry room space and all these other like parameters that every grow has as a nuance, if you could dial all those pieces in and balance them out the best possible, that's what's going to create success.
For sure.
Having one great crop out of 5 is never going to allude to success. So like, yeah, you could hit an out of the ballpark home run, but if you're always swinging for that out of the ballpark home run, you're bound to strike out more often than the person that's just focused on, hey, let me get around the bases.
Consistency.
Yes.
You got to have consistency, and within that 5 crops a year, that requires immense consistency with every aspect of the grow, from your mother and your stock plant program all the way through cloning and vegging and flowering and finishing as well, and then your cleanup. It all has to be so like on point, and everything has to go smoothly. And you're absolutely right, when equipment goes down and it's slated to be fixed, but then it doesn't get fixed, it creates headaches. It creates all these different needs to work around that limiting factor now that you have, and to create and curate your program differently, where it was working before and you could have sort of target numbers that are expected from each cycle. Now you're I don't know where I'm going to be at the end of this cycle because I can't operate to the fullest extent that I should be able to.
Yeah.
One of the things I did want to touch back on as well is the topping versus no topping, because of, well, it has a little bit of controversy. A lot of people look at topping as a way to maximize your canopy footprint. But you were actually the first person, you or Josh, I don't remember, brought this up at one point during a seminar that I attended for both of you. And you were talking about how we need to look at it as, yes, it's a surface area, but we need to look at it as a topographical surface area, where you have like a cone has more surface area than a circle. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, as well as sort of some of the findings that you might have seen there.
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't have plant counts anymore, so the idea of topping a plant to maximize the surface area was directly driven by only a limited plant count. So everybody's trying to grow these massive plants and maximize the square footage that they covered. So a lot of that originally came from that concept. And then what we learned really early on was that we could exponentially increase yield if we're exposing our plant to the maximum surface area. So if you're looking at a flat area in my palm, all right, this is X square feet. Now, if I go to a triangle, now I have this double the square footage being exposed to light. Light equals yield. Your leaf area index directly indicates what your yield is going to look like. We're not limited on plant count anymore. So we have the same canopy square footage, whether I've got 5 plants to it or 20 plants to it. The only difference really becomes is your labor. Believe it or not, we've moved away from running non-top plants. So
Really?
it used to be all top plants. Yeah, now we top in flower. And the sole reason why we do this is not because we get more yield, but because we reduce the labor in post-production.
Okay.
So again, we look at things very holistically and the whole picture of everything. So, all right, great. We just hit this awesome yield coming out of flower. What does the post production look like in processing it? What we found was that when we ran a non-top plant, we had this really beautiful, heavy top cola, but that does not fit in any jar, and nobody wants to buy it.
No.
So it became every time post production would come around, they're having to break apart these buds to fit them into the jars for them to be sellable. So that was a eye opener to us where we're like, all right, great, we have this awesome yield, but now we're spending all this extra money on breaking it down. Let's play around with topping the plants again and seeing if we can get a more homogeneous flower size. So we run non-top plants in veg, and then once they get into flower, we top them in flower on a specific day of flower. That has just been accumulated through trying tons of different genetics and what were the right days to be in to get the vertical growth out of it and see where the canopy goes. So we've come upon a date an arbitrary date that we're like, all right, hey, on this day you top the plants, and depending upon how tall they are will dictate how much we top it, but it keeps the structure of the plant the same as a non-top plant. However, we get more uniform flower size. So that was really just a lot of our drivers just looking at data, seeing that non-top plants actually yielded more for us with the manipulating planting density and created less labor. And then that evolved again, like we never know it all. So we keep evolving as growers, and that was one of our more, only in the last maybe year and some change did we start topping plants in flower, and that was because we were listening to the feedback from the trimmers and the post-production team and them telling us how they have to break down all of these buds, and it just didn't make sense. So when we got away with that, we lowered our cost of post-production and increased the profitability of the company that way.
That's the end goal, right? And just to touch on one of the terms that you use there for the viewers, leaf area index is the square footage of leaf per cubic foot of canopy. So it helps sort of you can have like a one leaf area index where you have 1 square foot of leaf per cubic foot of canopy, or you could have a 2 where you have 2 square feet of leaf per cubic feet of canopy. And that, there's an ideal there depending on the strain and depending on your environment to maximize your photosynthetic potential. So I just wanted to touch on that really quick to make sure that people were aware of that. And then also, one of the things that I've noticed too when we don't top is you are more susceptible to botrytis or to like other pathogens developing within these large buds that don't have a lot of airflow into the very center of the buds. And so by topping the plants, you increase sort of those auxiliary branch flower site sizes, but you also decrease the largest is no longer as large as that massive main cola. And then also one of the things that I've noticed, and I'd love some of your anecdotal feedback from this as well, or through your experiences, photo dependent pigmentation, where certain parts of the plant require that actual light exposure to cause the senescence and the pigmentation of that senescence to occur, versus some that will just sort of pigment through the genetic sequence that occurs within the plant's flowering cycle. Have you noticed this as well? And was there any sort of like determination on based on that factor that led you to topping as well?
Yeah, so the topping wasn't led by the senescence and seeing that photo change. However, we do de-leaf in the last weeks of flower to allow for uniform ripening of the plant because yeah, it was really clear that the tops of plants were turning purple and anything that was shaded out were bright lime green. So our goal is to get more uniform color. A lot of the reason why we look at LAI to bring that back into it is just if you have too crowded a plant and topping plants and veg, a lot of what we just kept trialing to figure out is when do you top the plant? And what we found is if you top it in veg, you get a really crowded canopy. So again, the depth of canopy is our number one indicator for yield. If you got a foot by two, a 1 foot deep canopy versus a 2 foot deep canopy, the 2 foot deep canopy is going to yield more than that one. So
Right.
with topping and controlling the structure of the canopy, the goal is to maximize light penetration while maintaining the photosynthetic effect of having fan leaves. So like if
Right.
we're gonna have these topped plants and then we're stripping all these fan leaves off and reducing the LAI of the plant, we actively reduce its photosynthetic capabilities. Like now they're not gonna be as hardy of a crop as the ones that we left the leaves on. So the goal is to get the right planting density, topping the plants at the right time, and managing those fan leaves, the LAI of the plant, to utilize as much light as they have. So you're paying for this source of light. We want the plants to absorb as much of that as possible. And then we manipulate the plant in the last weeks to reduce those fan leaves, uniform ripening in there, and get the plants, the crops senesce. So typically we're manipulating the light as well
For sure.
in those stages of things. Because if you're gonna take a bunch of fan leaves off the plant, you better expect that your climate's going to change and the plant's going to respond differently. So you have to manipulate now your climate and your lighting and your irrigation all at the same time as that cultural touch. So I think that when we look at topping and de-leafing and planting density, we're taking into account every one of these elements. And we're measuring the depth of canopy. How much light do we actually get underneath our canopy when we're doing these things? So like strategically touching them, because every time you remove a leaf from the plant, it's thinking it's being consumed. So it's going to have a generative response. And the idea is to use these cues throughout the cultivation practice with the data that we're collecting to maximize how they're consuming the light.
For sure.
And that's the goal with any cultivation is you're paying for this source of light. So we want to maximize that input as much as possible.
Yeah. And to bring it back to VPD at the end of the flower cycle, if you're having struggles there, removing a bunch of fan leaves that are transpiring all that moisture into the air is going to be a great lever to pull so that you can help hit those targets that you're aiming for.
Yeah, there's a direct correlation to us de-leafing and changing the temperature all at the same time and manipulating the light. So again, like every action has a reaction. So if you could
For
see
sure.
those correlations and you could time things correctly together, you're helping your equipment and you're getting this other result. That sounds like a very good strategy.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think that a lot of people overlook these things and they just go through and they're like, oh, hey, it's this day, I'm going to do this job and forget about all the other things that come with it. But if you could kind of start looking at what you're doing and tying all these steps in unison with each other, your output is going to be a lot better.
For sure. I mean, it seems like so many of your actions within the garden are so purposefully directed, where it's not something like oh, well, this worked last year, so I'm just going to do it again. I don't know why it worked, but I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
Like that's not something that we can do in this market nowadays. it doesn't make sense. There's no reason to be doing anything like that if you can't quantify or qualify those different results that you're seeing.
Yeah.
So I think
I
that's a
think
really,
taking a
really great
deep
point.
breath is key nowadays because you get either the sky is falling or a mentality that you're going to make it through. I've got an umbrella, like things are going to be okay. Take a deep breath, step back, look at everything, then make your decisions. Decisions don't have to be made right then and there. All hell could be going loose, but if you take that minute to just think for a second, usually you'll be able to solve for the problem a lot faster. Whether it's a flood happening in the facility or, whatever number of things go wrong, take a deep breath when you come across the problems and you'll start solving them a lot more effectively. And I think that in general, if you take a holistic approach to, hey, let me observe everything that's going on and then make decisions as to what it's doing and keep good data, you'll be a very effective grower and usually profitable. Because at the end of the day, I love this crop. I love what I do, but I wouldn't be here doing this if I wasn't able to turn a profit. I'd probably still be doing it, but I would be having to work other jobs too. And the
Yeah.
goal was always, hey, let's do this and make a profit on it. And I will be the first to say that if you're foolish enough in this game that you could do whatever you want and not worry about the profitability of the company, I won't be seeing you in the industry for too long. You'll be quickly
Yeah.
pushed out. And so the idea is, let's do things methodically and hopefully they are fruitful if we're really taking that scientific approach to it all and saying, all right, what do I observe? What do I want my outcome to be, and what can I change to achieve that outcome?
For sure.
Yeah, I think that it's no one answer that gets you there, and everybody's going to do a little bit different. But I would say that the core of what we're all doing is the same.
I agree. I agree. I mean, we're all growing the plant, right? And we're growing the plant for the flower that it's produced. I mean, even if you're growing for seeds, you're still trying to produce healthy flowers, right? So having that and really taking that step back when needed to sort of center yourself and say, listen, I'm just growing this plant. I got to make sure that I'm just doing that to the best of my ability. And some of the best growers are the calm, cool, and collected ones, like you said, that are really good at triage, because you're going to face problems and you just need to know the order in which to put them so that you aren't, you know, chasing down one problem while the whole building's burning down, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it does take sort of a lot of experience as well to get to that point where you understand what is a priority and how you should prioritize different aspects of the grow, and when you do need to hit the panic button, or when you can just say, listen, I need to take a step back, take a deep breath, like you said, and figure out where to go from here. And we've this kind of leads me to a question, because other than your early issues with the heat that you were facing in some of those tent grows early on, it seemed as though you learned a lot from successes that you were finding in the garden. And I always like to find out, what are some of the failures that you've faced as a gardener that helped you really up your game or learn something extremely important?
Well, I would say, to correct you, I've learned all my successes from failures. I've got
Fair
millions and
enough.
millions of dollars in failures. We learned failures with pests. Just simple IPM routines are the better IPM routines. People spray way too much shit on their plants, hoping that that's going to get rid of pests. Cultural practices are the best way to get rid of pests. If you're maintaining a clean environment and clean facility, and you're changing your clothes and your shoes and things like that, and be mindful, your pest pressure is going to be a lot lower than the people next to you spraying 1,000 different things trying to go through it. So failures, I failed from everything. Irrigation failures, we still are improving our irrigation design stuff. So originally we were doing Netaflexes. We do dosatrons now. Simple. I could walk
I love
anybody around the
dosatrons.
world how to use a dosatron system. Even the manifold systems that we've created for dosatron, we've simplified that. We go to batch tanks. We don't direct inject to rooms anymore. We changed the sizes of batch tanks. So many things from failure points. AC units, 15-ton units, ones that have dehumidification, all this bullshit included into it. Fuck all that. 5-ton carrier or train units. That's what works. Why? Because I could get parts today for any of those units anywhere in the United States. If something fails, then I have parts readily available. So when we're going through, and this has been a lesson that we've just recently relearned because we built a facility that's like state-of-the-art facility, but some of the parts come from abroad. Now with everything going on, they're not easily to get a hold of. So we keep coming back to this keep it simple side of things. So how quickly can we get a hold of parts and equipment, having redundancy? Those are all big things. Failures everywhere. Like I've failed every possible thing. I've killed thousands of plants. I've lost millions of dollars. You go through so much of the day-to-day rigmarole that what has brought success to me is saying, okay, when I do fail, how can I prevent this from happening again in the future? Or how can I solve for this problem faster when it does happen again? So if I can't prevent it from happening again in the future, how can I be ready for it to happen again in the future and solve for that? So everything that we've taken on has become more and more simple. So like a prime example of this is we used to grow everything in little Rockwell cubes and then move them to the flower room and then flower them that day, and we put them on either Rockwell slabs or a cocoa bag. This last year, maybe 2 years, we started direct sowing into 1-gallon cocoa bags. Why? Straight up because if we had a couple plants that weren't thriving as well in that Rockwell cube, when we put them into flower, those would die. If we direct sow into the cocoa bags, we don't have that issue anymore. We stopped using Rockwell slabs because when irrigation systems fail, whether it's a cultural practice that led it to failure or a mechanical thing that failed, we still have a failure. So when we dried back too far, it was really way too hard to rehydrate. So we moved to cocoa. I cut my teeth on Rockwell, and I thought that was always going to be the substrate I use, and now I use cocoa because we had so many failures where an employee would clean the filter and forget to reopen up a valve or this or that. So we constantly keep simplifying that system. For humidification, we have just, fog co units that spray a fine mist in there. Very simple system, it's not overly complicated. We keep going back to simplicity of everything. I'd say that we've failed on every level you could possibly think. Fires happening in facilities, employees quitting on us, you name it, like going through it. And when you go through that, you quickly learn how to solve for it. So like, how do we solve for employees quitting on us? We created very modular jobs where we have professionals in certain verticals. So if we have one employee quit, we could quickly bring somebody else in and train them up to speed, because what we learned with this within any industry, employees are going to quit because they want to get more money. And once they learn a lot, it's really easy for them to go get another job. So my statement has always been is I'll teach you enough you can get any job you want, but I'll treat you well enough that hopefully you never want to leave. But that's also wishful thinking. I can't hate on somebody when they learn a lot and they want to climb the ladder, but the ceiling's kind of capped for them. So their only real option is to leave for somebody else. So we've figured out how to compartmentalize the factory of things and build it up to where I could take an employee from any one facility and pop them into the next facility, and they'll go right into it because they know all the SOPs and they know the standards. So I'd say failures are the inevitable. I failed at everything. Literally, you name it, I've failed at doing it. But we come up with solutions every time we fail, and we make it easier and easier and easier. And the easier we make it for our employees and team to succeed, the better our results are. And I don't expect them to have the knowledge that I have anymore. And running a commercial facility, that assumption that the staff and the team are going to be just as good as you is an assumption. Like it's very rare they're going to come across people that are going to love the job, and you will come across people that do. But if you go into it as, hey, how can I make their job as easy as possible to where they're enjoying work and like working for this company, and we're getting success out of them, those are, a lot of what we're solving for now. So I would say failures, AC failures, lighting failures, controller failures, irrigation failures, pest failures, all these things, we've kind of taken them and just kept simplifying the job as much as possible till we got to this foundation that the likelihood of having that failure again is very slim. And in the
Sure.
case that it does happen, we've hopefully created enough safety net that we don't have an economic loss. We don't have a complete crop loss, or we're not taking a complete failure in there. They do happen still to this day. I guess one of them that recently came up at a facility was CO2 sensor calibration. That's probably the most common failure point that I have in running commercial grows now is CO2 sensors failing, and then it get to toxic levels, and that kill the crop because something you can't visually see. If your sensor's reading
Sure.
it's 1,000 ppm in the room, you're assuming it's 1,000 ppm in the room, but unless you go in there with a secondary sensor and check that, so like now we have this rolling SOP at every facility across the nation that every week you walk into every room and you check the calibration of the sensors. And that's mitigated a lot of our issues with it, because what happens when you're spraying a room, if they're not removing the climate sensor from the room or covering it, it gets sprayed, and the CO2 sensor is the most sensitive sensor out of all the sensors that we have in there, and that tends to be the one that goes first. And it's the most deadly because you get 1,600, 2,000 ppm lights on, you're going to be killing the plants, and you're going to be searching for everything that's the problem, not seeing that. So that was our more recent failure that we've had to solve for by creating a cultural practice of going in and checking the calibration of these sensors on a weekly basis, and then gotten really good at removing them when spraying too.
For sure. That's a really good point. I don't think I've ever personally ran into CO2 toxicity. What are some of the symptoms of that?
It looks like an overwatering plant upon first sight, where you'll start seeing drooping leaves, you'll start seeing purpling of the stalk, then you'll start seeing a lot more necrotic growth, and
Okay.
then your roots will actually die on you, and then you'll just have a dead plant. Um,
Wow.
so you're really lucky that you haven't come across it, but it's a very common issue. I get a lot of growers that hire Josh and myself for consulting, and we'll come into the facility and we bring our meter, and you would be amazed at how many sensors were wildly off, causing all their issues. And as soon as they got calibrated sensors and stuff that was working right, then everything went better. And this is also a word to the wise, is that you shouldn't calibrate your sensor yourself. So what I mean by this is setting offsets only further throw the calibration off on your equipment. So if you're going to need to get equipment calibrated, send it back into the company and they will calibrate it for you. But setting an offset on your controller is not even a band-aid on the problem. It's only going to cause you more issues.
For something that's simple like one of the Titan CO2 controllers where it just has you take it says, hold for 5 seconds, calibrate in an open air area. Is that sort of the calibration you're talking about?
Yeah, I
Or
wouldn't do any
is
of those. Yeah,
you wouldn't you wouldn't do that?
no, because it's just it's setting an offset to the sensor. It's not actually calibrating it. Those are just setting
Wow.
offsets. So like it's a false calibration. So if you really want to calibrate something, you got to send it into the company because they have way more scientific means of calibrating your equipment. So yeah, we're only as good as the data that we're relying on. So if everything we're relying on is not reliable, then we're steering in the dark more or less.
For sure. Wow, that's a great point. I did not know that about the calibration of especially CO2 sensors needing to be in a much more rigorous environment to be recalibrated in. That's very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that you could just send equipment in and the manufacturers provide you with all this information, but a lot of us were so tunnel vision that you
Sure.
you forget about these assets that you have. And, when you're buying equipment from a company, use them as an asset, reach out to them. They will tell you the proper way to do it. You don't have to create it. I think a lot of people forget that you can read directions.
Absolutely. Well, and then there's the whole stigma of this industry still, where there's even parts of larger agritech and other like agricultural businesses that won't even deal with cannabis if you lead with that in the conversation.
Hmm.
And 10 years ago, it was out of the question for most companies to even if they did it, on the back end, like how you were talking about with Grodan, like they didn't openly say that they were dealing with cannabis growers, but they were dealing with cannabis growers and trying to perfect their strategies for their product for those growers, because they were a huge market share of the people that were purchasing their products.
Yep.
So that's a really great point, and people should definitely look into the companies and the technology that they are using and what those companies' recommendations are and the directions. Like you said, we should definitely be reading directions.
Well, where your companies are based, because look, if you buy something from an international company and they're promising in the world, but then you're on completely different time zones and getting stuff shipped from them over here is not realistic. When that equipment does fail, because all equipment's going to fail at some point, how easy it is to get a hold of them. So just be, an informed consumer, and this will lead you to better results, because you want to make sure the things that you're relying on can be relied on. And in case that it does fail, how quickly can you get a replacement or get it fixed? That's a lot of what we look at now, because running a commercial facility, we don't have much of a choice. Like there's way too much money on the line, that failure is not an option.
No, no, the whole what, like I think 5 years ago, the acceptable standard was, you have your 5 crops per year and you have one acceptable crop loss every 2 years to maintain where you are. And now that's just almost like unthinkable in terms of the actual loss that you would face as a company.
Yeah,
Man, this has been such a great conversation so far, and I feel like I want to just keep diving into more of your current like projects and stuff, but I feel like we are running a little bit low on time, and I want to get to a couple more of these broad topic questions just to get your thoughts on it.
shoot, why don't you
And
roll
maybe
through
we
the
can
questions and then we could schedule another time to talk again.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have something I want to bring up with you to see if you'd be interested in it. We've been talking with Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics, and we want to do like a friendly conversation debate about ad the the advantageousness, I guess, of organics versus salts in a commercial setting, because you deal a lot with salts, he deals a lot with organics, and I think that that would be a fun conversation to have, just to sort of see from two different people that are not only producing the nutrients but also directly interacting with the companies that they are selling these nutrients to sort of see where that conversation lies, because it is such a
Absolutely.
heavily debated topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be very clear, they're not mutually exclusive from one
No.
another. You could be running synthetic fertilizers, and when I say synthetic, it's just refined mineral.
Yeah. I say
Calcium's
salts
calcium. Yeah,
because synthetic
salts.
sounds
Yeah,
bad.
yeah, it does sound bad, but salts. Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. So yeah, we still run organics with our fertilizer. There are so many things that you could add in that have just are scientifically proven. I always say mycorrhiza is no different. Buying a bag of mycorrhiza is no different than buying a bag of fertilizer. Like there's really no
You're
difference.
absolutely right. I think that it'll be a really fun conversation,
Yeah,
because I have a very similar mentality to you, and I know that he also has a very similar mentality of like, if you're using something and the results are what you're aiming for, or you're aiming for certain results and that's what you're achieving with the addition of this product, and it's not something where you're over applying it or doing something that's a bad practice in general,
hmm,
then it if it's working, you should definitely consider it.
yeah,
So yeah,
I
that'll be
agree.
fun. But
Informed decisions are the best decisions. So yeah, I'm absolutely down to talk about that and get on another call with them.
awesome, yeah, that'll be fun then. Well, with all of your experience, going from a home grower doing your outdoor grows to, doing a 2 lighter, all the way through, moving up, so to say, in the ranks of in the grower world, and seeing all these different aspects of it from both the product side of things with Grodan and Arroya and your own company now, as well as actually being there in the trenches doing the work. What are some of the things that you would like to see change within the cultivation industry, either, commercially or home growers or culturally as an industry? What are some of those things that you might want to see change?
I would love to see the barrier to entry continue to drop. It is getting lower and lower, which is awesome because I think that there should be more craft grows out there. I think the biggest thing that I would love to see change in our industry is I don't know how to phrase this. Is basically to see the greed go away. Like I think that there's this mentality that if somebody else is winning, I can't win too. And yeah, there's so much greed where people believe they got to be the biggest and they have to have all the market, the market share and all that stuff. Like there's so much in this industry to go around that I think if you could get rid of the greed and that desire and kind of focus on your lane, then you're going to succeed. I feel like so many people want to be loud out there and call attention to themselves versus just putting your head down, grinding, do what you do best, and let your product speak for itself. I feel like entering into the different verticals, there's a lot of this, scarcity mentality, and I don't think that needs to be there. I think that we could all succeed. There's so much money to be shared. I love to see wealth distribution. So I hope to see more craft farms opening up and then people focusing on what they do best and let that drive and predicate their success. Great that you're looking over and seeing what your friends and your colleagues are doing. Use that as a way of sharing information so we could all succeed. But I miss the days of when people just truthfully, openly shared with one another with no filter, and that allowed for everybody to move the envelope further. And I think if we went back to that craft mentality of things where we all had our home grows and stuff like that, there is a great simplicity to that life that I miss. Now we have to do, I say I work 10 times harder to earn the same money that I did before. Year over year, I'm working harder and harder and harder, investing more and more time into this just to have the same earnings.
Sure.
And, you see it, we all see it in the price point. The price of our product keeps going down and down because somebody's getting caught on a shit ton of product and lowering that margin. So I think that if I could see any change in this industry, more people will have the gall to open up their own facilities and run their facilities and not want to be the biggest, but want to produce just a quality product. And there are brands out there that are doing this that are really, really great. And I think it's cool to see people focusing on just like, hey, what do I do great? Let me not worry about being the biggest. Let me just put out some of the best product I can do. So yeah, to answer that question is more wealth distribution and a lower barrier to entry.
I love that answer, and I really like the idea. It makes me think of this. Something that you said makes me think of the idea of your only competition should be yourself, and you should really be trying to beat who you were, basically. And we do this in life all the time through our maturing process as human beings, through just different pathways of learning. We're not necessarily trying to be better than the person next to us. I mean, some people, that's their mentality, but it doesn't help you achieve the best version of yourself. And in the grow world, the best version of yourself could be synonymous with the best version of what your grow can produce. And if you are always trying to make, I've heard it said before, like, 95% of the grow you're going to learn, and it's going to remain stagnant, and it's that last 5% that you need to just continue to strive to get better at, and always try to, remove the fail points here, tighten up a little bit here, make this process a little bit easier, reduce the stress from this other process as much as possible, and just almost like trying to maintain a stasis, but just with little tiny tweaks of improvement every step of the way.
Yeah, I think that's the key with all of this is, look, when we set out and we made cocoa recently and started doing that, there's a lot of like, oh, there's so many other cocoa companies out there. Why do this? Well, because we want something made the way we want to make it. We didn't do this because we wanted to get richer. We did it because we actually want to have a product designed and made to a certain degree. And if we always were looking at what everybody else was doing versus just thinking about like, what can we do that will create a really quality product for ourselves, I would be copying the things that other people were doing versus trying to to invent something or put something out that is different than other people's. And I think that that's the idea. When somebody asks us, why should I switch to your fertilizer? Because it's different than other people's. I'm not, you won't catch me saying I'm the best, because I don't think I'm the best. I really don't. There's so many great growers out there that I'd be stupid if I was saying I'm the best and better than all these people, because I know I'm not. Like, there's so many great people out there. What I'm good at doing is differentiating myself from others, and that, I think that's what creates, I think that's one of the most attractive pieces to the cannabis industry, is that there's so much uniqueness in this. Every time you start a seed, whether you bought it from a breeder or not, every time you start a seed, you have something unique. There is no two seeds that are identical. So if we could do so many things that are within our uniqueness and yet still follow maybe a game plan, there's plenty for us all to succeed on and have our own micro wins. And I think that's a big part of life. I got off of social media because I was so tired of the look at me mentality. Like, I still use it. It's a business. I'm a business. Yeah. Like, I need to make money. So like, social media is a great way to make money, but let's use it as a way to connect to others and share versus flaunt. Yes. And that's a big thing that I think is important for us as a cultural group of people that are in this industry together, is let's elevate one another, and let's stop flaunting as if everything's perfect in life, because that's not the reality to it. So I think that holding some of those things key. If you're putting yourself out there, hopefully you're being received well, and even if you're not, take the criticism and do your best to improve from it. Don't let that bury you, because the criticism could easily bury you. Just keep being creative. It kind of goes back to that statement of like a lower barrier to entry, so more people could be in this industry, better wealth distribution, and more opportunity for all of us to succeed. And I think, don't desire to be the biggest. That should not be your goal. Like, your goal should be freedom to have time to do the things you enjoy, freedom to have time with your family, the financial success that you're not strapped for money. Like, that's success in a nutshell for me.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And one of the main reasons why I started this podcast was because finding good information from people who are down to earth like yourself and a lot of my other guests, it was really hard to find 5 to 10 years ago. And there was not a lot of sort of open, honest discussion about, like, not only the successes, but the failures that people are facing and the journey that it took to get there. And so I always like to say, we share this information because that's the way we grow as a community, as individuals, and as growers. And we can continue those little bits of self-improvement along the way, and all of them are going to add up over time. And so, man, thank you for joining me today, for being a part of this podcast, and for sharing a lot of your journey, because you have one of the more unique stories, in my opinion, just considering the steps that you took, and that you did have this sort of constant progression through your career and through your journey with this plant. It's very inspiring, and I feel like a lot of people can look at it and say, man, that's like, yeah, I love this plant. I find it interesting. I can take this information that I'm learning and that I'm imbibing into myself, and maybe I can pass it on to other people, or learn a better way to apply it, or maybe hone these skills that I'm learning so that I can better myself as a grower and as a person overall. So Ramsey, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a wonderful conversation. I think this is a great point for us to start to wrap it up here. I do have a couple of ubiquitous cannabis podcast questions that I like to ask at the end. So what is your favorite strain of all time? And as someone who is so well versed in growing, I'd like to hear it from both your grower standpoint as well as a consumer standpoint.
So this is an easy question for me to answer. Blackjack. By
Blackjack?
far, blackjack. Yes. It's I forget what the crosses were. I don't even think I ever really knew. It was a Jack
Black
Herrera.
Domina, Jack Herrera.
Yeah, and it
Yep.
it honestly was the easiest plant for me to grow. I love sativas. It's sad that our industry does not really sell sativas much anymore. It's harder and harder to find. My wife always is like, "Can you bring me home a sativa?" And I was like, "I don't have a sativa. I have hybrids. Like everything's very hybridized." But yeah, I love that pine flavor to the smoke. You know, a good midday joint where you could smoke it. It's got this like zesty flavor to it. Growing wise, so easy. It was pest resistant. I would have, if I had multiple genetics in a room, 3 or 4 of them maybe got a pest, and the blackjack never would get anything. It was just, I could throw everything at it. It rooted really quickly. It would take only like 10 days for me to have fully rooted cuttings, trays of cuttings. Veg is really easy. It just hit every benchmark that I wanted. It was done by day 60. It had purple to it and was like completely ripened and finished. So that fell within my like 63-day time frame for things to be finished on. It just was an all around easy, produced great hash where like the people that would buy my trim off of me, they sold a lot of like their rosin and whatever else they were making it as if it came straight from flower, because it would just be
Sure.
blonde, clear. The trichome heads on it were really well developed. So yeah, blackjack was my go-to favorite. I haven't grown it in probably a good like 7 or 8 years now, but it was a go-to. Really enjoyed it. Super easy.
For sure. That's a man, I haven't thought of blackjack in a while. That was one of the first strains, cultivars that I grew when I entered into the commercial space, and it crushed. It was amazing. It was one of the plants where like everything else in the room, there was an issue. Like something was getting overwatered, something had a little bit of like spider mite problems, and another one had powdery mildew, and this one was boop, just
Praying,
go.
yeah. Charging along, yeah. I honestly, it was a great genetic for that. I liked it because I could take it anywhere and people would have success with it. So it was like great on that level.
Nice. And because Jack gets so much hate, Jack Terps, like everyone's like, I'm fucking over Jack Herrera and Jack Terps. But man, there is something that was in that blackjack where it was like, it had a little bit of that sort of floral fruitiness, but it wasn't overpowering. And there was like sort
No.
of this almost like sativa-esque, like piney spiciness to it that was really nice.
Yeah,
And
the funny
I
things too. Yeah.
my vote is that we need to go back to like the old Amsterdam pricing market where your price was based on how long the plant flowered for.
Yes.
So, we can start bringing sativas back, because there's got to be people out there that'll pay, $300 an ounce for a really nice like super silver haze or something.
It's the brokers that are messing everything up, because when I talk to the consumers, everybody I know is always like, "Oh, do you have anything that's like a Jack or a Blue Dream?" Or, they list off a dozen different sativas and none of them are available. So I'm like, if every consumer I talk to is saying this, then why isn't it being sold? And it's the middleman that's dictating it, because they like the way this pound works.
And there's
that's
some
a
guy
whole different
just
bureaucracy of it all.
there's some guy taking green Mac 1 and just calling it whatever sativa they want.
Yeah, legitimately.
Yeah, that's one of the big problems with the market, honestly, and that's such a great point that you brought up because for me, one of the things that I want to change is that disconnect between grower and consumer, and there has to be some way to provide more direct relief to people. Relief being the medicine side of it, but also the information of like being able to do farm tours and stuff like that, where it's still sort of this gray area, hazy area of like it's semi-legal if you sign them all in, but how many people want to get signed in? And it's that's
I
a
think that
frustrating one.
the statement I made earlier, reigns true, is barrier to entry and that microbrewery feel. I
Yes.
learned so much about beer and the different methodologies to brewing beer and this and that by going to breweries.
Yeah.
Like the consumer doesn't have that. You get a lot more associated brands when you could go visit the establishment in which the brand is there. I'm happy to see packaged goods out in the market space though, because forever, I thought I was crazy saying that there would be, that everything would be packaged, but finally we're getting there. So I think slowly the consumer is going to start getting more and more clever to it because you hear about it here and there where consumers like, oh, I'll buy anything from this brand,
Yeah.
and I think that that's going to happen more and more as they get a lot more aware of it. The new emerging states, there's still so many that are young, like here in New Jersey, New York area, when you go to dispensaries, they sell you by strain, not by farm. So like
Yeah.
I think that as that converts over, when I go to a West Coast dispensary, they sell you by brand, not by strain. Like if you ask for a strain, they're going to be like, "Oh, we have it from these brands," and
Yep.
then they might educate you a little bit more there. But they reference the brand a lot more than they do here on the East Coast. So I think slowly but surely it's going to come more and more, and like um, to your point, when they're allowed to come on site and meet the farmers and meet these things, I think that'll come about. Just a matter of time at this point.
Absolutely. It makes me think of like the wine industry too, because I spent a lot of time in the Napa Valley. I went to the Culinary Institute there a lifetime ago at this point when I was still a chef. And one of the big things that you would do is you'd go around to all the different wineries because they had their tasting rooms and you could sort of meet the wine producer, the winemaker, the agronomist that was running their property, and you could talk to them about the terroir of their land and how their Pinot Noir was had these sort of notes and profiles. And then you'd go a few miles down the road, and these people say, "Oh, well, we blend it with from this region and this region," and you start to build a palette of like what tastes different within something that is more or less the same thing if it's
Hmm.
they're all growing it from the same cutting and from the same rootstock. And so if we as growers are all growing, I, I there's so many strains that are out there that people can grow, but there's maybe like 100 that are really hitting the market at any given time that are really pushing numbers and driving sales. And a lot of the difference is the growing style. I hear people say that their phenotypic like profile is going to differ from one grow to another, and so it's really important to know that, and then as consumers to be educated about that so that you can experience these things differently and experience it with a more educated nuance. I think that that's definitely something that, like you're saying, the barrier to entry needs to be brought down so that we can offer those experiences to people because it is an experience, right? It's not necessarily just like medicine at that point or recreational proclivity at that point. There's a whole experience to it that you can, people say, oh, I remember my trip to the wine country, or I remember my trip to like a up here in Oregon, there's breweries everywhere, and people are like, I went on a brewery tour and I hit up 5 different breweries, and it's this memorable experience that people really look back at 5-10 years later and have a fond memory of. And we need to open that up for cannabis farms too, because it is just another proclivity that we as human beings like to indulge in.
Well, I think the thing too is that our consumer base is also developing too, because still right now in the market space, a lot of people shop for THC potency versus
Yeah.
just flavor. Like that. I think that as shoppers start becoming more and more clever to flavor and like that experience, the overall consumption experience, not just the effect. Because I look at it as there's two different types of consumers. The one that are going into it for the overall, process and jump of consuming versus the effects. Like you have effect-based consumers and you have like the process-based consumers.
Sure.
Is
Yeah.
kind of the way I'm looking at it. And so you have ones that are going for that terpene, that palate, that flavor, the aroma of all of it. They want to enjoy the whole experience of consuming. And then you have others that they're solely looking at it like, hey, which one am I going to get the highest off of?
For sure.
So I think like as our audience continues to mature, that will lead into a lot more of these, more enjoyable experiences that will open up more to a whole. Because I would say, like, when I go to a lot of events, I'm often turned off by the event because the audience is not there for the experience; they're there for the high, and that there needs to be a huge delineation between the groups. Because, like, if we attract more of an audience that is there for the experience, I think it's going to be more enjoyable for the whole of everybody, because there's going to be a lot more conversation based out of it versus like what free things can I get and like how high can I get in that moment. So I think that those things are evolving before us, and as they continue to evolve and we get a little bit more of a mature audience to it, because at the end of the day, I don't know how old you are, but I'm 38 years old, and I feel like my generation is very, they're a lot more established into what their consumption looks like, versus, a lot more of the younger demographic that's just getting introduced to it. So because our age group is really driving a lot of this industry and like, plus or minus a couple years on here, I think that we're going to see more of these develop as we continue to expand in that market space. And so I think the consumption and lounges and all this stuff will start to evolve to be more of a social gathering place, and
Yeah.
places that are for the experience more than the effect. And
Man, I
that I think is a
agree.
big piece.
I can't wait for there to be consumption lounges that are more ubiquitous and more readily accepted. It makes me think of like, because I'm only a few years younger than you. I'm 34 now, I think. I always forget my age
Yeah,
because it just stops mattering at a certain
yeah,
point.
it does.
But I remember back in the day going to Spark in San Francisco, where they
Yeah,
had all of the volcano vaporizers set up, and you'd go there and you'd have this experience with your buddies, and you'd go in there, buy an eighth of whatever the hot stuff was, and you'd burn through that whole thing on the vaporizers, and then you'd just go out and you'd sort of be floating through San Francisco and just taking it all in, and that was just a blast. It was one of the
yes,
it was like a monthly ritual for us because it wasn't that much more expensive than going to the local dispensary. You just hop on BART, $5 into the city, and you have this whole new level of experience that you're there to enjoy, rather than just like, oh, I just got to get the highest I possibly can. That was me in college. And then after I like sort of found why I liked cannabis, it was more about having these experiences and the ritual of it, and sort of almost like, having that glass of wine after a long day of work, or having that beer, or, kicking back with your friends when you go to the beach and having like a barbecue or something like
yes,
that. It's
yes.
very experiential, and you can incorporate cannabis into that just as much, and it can be this whole new layer of experience. I
I
really like it.
that you and I are speaking the same language. That's exactly my thought pattern behind it. Because when it becomes that, at the end of the day, somebody is associating that release of stress with the flavor and the experience of rolling the joint and or packing the bong or however they want to consume whatever it may be, look like, but that whole experience and that process, and I think that to me is what's going to help elevate our industry too, because yeah, I honestly I look for more events and things that attract that demographic of people versus the ones that are just showing up just to smoke and get high, because
Yeah.
I want the social aspect of it. I want that connection and communication and vibe, to say, like, I don't want to go there and it just be like everybody getting blitzed and just the riffraff of music of things of like, no, I want the scene of a chill feeling of as if I'm going to a bar, you know, like as if
Yeah.
I'm going to a lounge, a wine lounge, or anything else like that. Because yeah, I think that like when I go to the breweries and those things and have that vibe where you're getting to eat food and chill and communicate, and it's the experience that drives that whole ambiance and feeling to it. That's kind of what I'm searching for now
Yeah.
is how do we kind of be a part of that and help create it and facilitate it. And yeah, I think that's going to also improve the industry as a whole because now people aren't shopping based off potency, they're shopping based off of quality.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's such a great point because we as humans are such social beings and social creatures. And, you got to wonder that how much of the antisocial behavior that is associated with potheads or stoners is just due to the stigma, right? Of
So
like
much so. So
how
much
the
so.
culture surrounds them and pushes them into this antisocial behavior
Yeah.
when it could be just like a bar. It could be just like, going to a music festival and hanging out with friends. It's something to consume with people and to enjoy together. And I believe wholeheartedly in what you're saying. I really like that.
You know what took me the longest habit it's taken me to break is stop lying. And what I mean by this is that for our entire career of being in this since I've been 15 years old, we were forced to lie. What do you do for a living? Construction. What do you do for a living? I'm this, I'm that. Like you were taught to hide. You had to hide
Hmm.
what you're doing in your house or wherever. So much was predicated on this idea of hiding your identity and your reality that I echo what you're saying. It
Yeah.
created this element of antisocial because you're already smoking, so you're in your head a lot. Like that's a beautiful part of smoking. And then you're in your head and you're thinking like, oh, does this person know? Hey, well, what the fuck does it matter if they know now? Like, hey, I'm being me. But it's taken forever to break that down, and I think that it's going to go a couple steps further to be able to break down the social stigmas that came with this and make it more socially acceptable, make it to where you're not feeling like you have to be so underground with it. Yeah, but I think that we're on the right path, and I think that's key is just everybody wanting to elevate. I do have to get going because I have kids that I need to help get ready for bed.
Totally
But
understood. Do you mind if I
that's
just ask you two quick questions?
two.
All right. Favorite breeder?
Favorite breeder, Symbiotic.
Cool.
Michael from Symbiotic. The guy is awesome. Michael's been just genuinely, and he always searched for what he saw was quality. He didn't care about potency or anything like that. And I really would say that his genetics always were true to what they were supposed to be. And he bred with males versus just feminizing everything, which I loved.
For sure. Yeah, that's awesome. A symbiotic gets a lot of love. And then last question, what is your most memorable cannabis or smoking related experience?
Sitting on the back of my truck with my wife, smoking a joint. Is probably one of the things that really connected us. She was out in San Diego, and we went to Sunset Cliffs, and we smoked a joint on the back of my tailbed of my truck, and that will always resonate as a very memorable moment in my life.
Right on. Yeah, me and my wife, very similar. Our first date was walking through a vineyard smoking a blunt. So
Yeah,
I love
something
that.
about that. When you connect with the person you love, there's nothing better.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Ramsey, I'll let you get going to your family, but thank you again so much for joining me today. This was a wonderful conversation, and I'm sure that everyone's going to love this.
Oh, you're very welcome, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you.